Ever get that feeling? Like when you hear about these behind-the-scenes rumblings, these changes that could totally reshape things without making big news.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like undercurrents.
Exactly. Well, something like that's happening now in the federal government, and it all comes down to, like, who does the buying, the contracting work for different agencies?
You're talking about the potential reorganization, where the GSA, the General Services Administration, might be taking over contracting from other agencies.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a big one. Lots of potential ripple effects there.
Huge. And we're basing this whole deep dive on this article from Federal News Network. They laid out a lot of the initial details.
Right.
And what we're trying to do here is really grasp how big this could be, what it would actually look like if it happened, and what it could mean for how the government works.
Absolutely.
On the one hand, it seems like it could streamline things,
Right.
make things more efficient. But then immediately you start wondering, how much freedom would individual agencies have?
Yeah, autonomy.
Yeah.
Would they lose some of that?
Exactly. And could there be problems along the way? Hiccups in the system.
Disruptions, yeah.
For sure.
Sure.
So let's get into it. This Federal News Network article really digs into this email that went out to employers within the GSA, specifically their Federal Acquisition Service, FAS.
Right.
And this email, it basically floated this idea of creating a whole new entity within the GSA that would just handle contracting for all civilian agencies.
Mm-hmm. A centralized contracting body.
Yeah. And we're not talking about just like tweaking a few forms here and there. This has the potential to be a fundamental shift in how procurement happens across the entire government.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. They even give an example in the email. They talk about the Office of Personnel Management, OPM. Historically, they've handled their own contracting.
Right.
But under this new plan, that could all shift over to the GSA. So, you have to wonder, who else is on that list?
Yeah, exactly. Like if OPM's on the table, who else is being considered? And the article does give us some hints. It quotes a GSA employee. And they suggest some of the agencies being looked at for this. Besides OPM, we're talking the Education Department, the Small Business Administration, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Wow. So, like, a real mix.
Yeah, a very diverse group. When you think about it, these agencies all have such different missions, different priorities.
For sure.
And you got to assume they have their own unique needs when it comes to contracting.
Totally. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all situation.
No, not at all. And the way this GSA employee talks about it, it's not just a one-off idea.
Mm-hmm.
They're presenting it as part of this bigger reorganization happening within FAS,
Right.
with the goal of basically consolidating contracting across the whole government.
Centralized system.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
These initial agencies, it's almost like a pilot program to see how this could work on a larger scale.
Makes sense. But, what about the people in those agencies, like the existing staff? What happens to them?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, the article kind of hints that if this goes through, these agencies could lose their acquisition staff
Wow.
through what they call a RIF, or reduction in force, or maybe they'd be transferred to the GSA.
So that's a huge shift in, like, human resources,
Yeah,
expertise being moved around.
definitely. And it seems like the GSA is moving pretty fast with this. The article mentions an internal communication, asking GSA employees if they'd want to be part of this new organization.
Oh, wow.
And the deadline to express interest is noon on Tuesday. That's not a lot of time to think it over.
No, not at all. So they're serious about this, it seems.
Yeah, very much so. And the article even says that FAS Commissioner Josh Gruenbaum is getting regular updates. And there's a tiger team, like a special task force, made up of high-level procurement people and chief financial officers.
A dedicated team.
Exactly. And they point out this is because there's, quote, notable risk involved.
Notable risk.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, right? What are they worried about?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what could go wrong? And it gets even more complicated when you think about this. The article mentions that the vendors, the companies actually doing the contracting work, they probably don't even know about these potential changes.
Oh, wow. So no heads up.
Nope. And the obvious concern there is that existing contracts could get disrupted.
For sure. I mean, if the entity managing a contract changes hands, even if the agreement stays the same, there's always a chance of things getting messed up.
Oh, yeah. Miscommunication, payments getting delayed, services being interrupted, and then just that period of adjustment while the new team gets up to speed.
It's a lot to navigate.
It really highlights how intricate federal contracting is, and the timeline they're apparently working with is pretty aggressive. The article mentions March 30th as the target date for the GSA to take over contracting for these initial agencies.
March 30th. That's like right around the corner. to pull off such a big change.
I know, right? It's a very short time frame. And it's not just those agencies that are affected. The article mentions that the contracting functions within the GSA's public building service, the part that handles federal properties, they'll be impacted too.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just absorbing work from other agencies. There are internal changes happening within the GSA itself.
Exactly. It's like a two-pronged approach. Okay, so let's zoom out for a second. Think bigger picture. The article does a good job of connecting these GSA plans back to some previous discussions. Remember when the Trump administration was talking about merging OPM and GSA into one big agency?
Right. Yeah, that generated a lot of buzz.
It did. A lot of people were talking about that. And the article even reminds us that there was a report just last month from Federal News Network again, saying that Trump administration officials were still kicking around that merger idea.
So the idea of consolidation, it's been floating around for a while.
It has. It's not brand new.
Yeah.
And if you remember, President Trump actually did try to merge GSA and OPM during his first term. But it didn't happen. Those plans fell through. So this concept of bringing these agencies closer together, at least in terms of their functions, it's not totally out of left field. It seems like it's popping up again, maybe in a slightly different form.
That's a good point. A full-on merger might be too difficult to pull off.
Right.
But maybe this approach, focusing on specific functions, like contracting, it's a way to achieve some of the same goals, like efficiency and streamlining.
Yeah, yeah. And it gets even more interesting when you factor in another thing from the article, that President Trump's thinking about an executive order.
Okay, so another executive order, what's this one about?
This one's aimed at essentially eliminating the education department.
Whoa, okay. That's a huge change if it happens.
It would be. And the article mentions this draft memo from the Education Department. Federal News Network got a hold of it.
Right.
And it basically lays out a plan for figuring out which functions, programs, and offices within the department aren't required by law.
So they're getting ready for a scenario where they might be downsized.
Exactly. It's like they're doing this internal review to see what they can get rid of, and then they have to come up with a plan for moving those functions to other agencies that might be better suited to handle them.
So preparing for a potential shift in responsibilities.
Yeah. And even though Education Secretary Linda McMahon said that Congress created the department and they can't just shut it down without their approval, this memo still shows that they're thinking seriously about making some big changes.
Makes sense. If the writing's on the wall, you got to be prepared.
For sure. And this brings us right back to the GSA and this contracting thing. If the Education Department is looking to shed some responsibilities, their contracting operations seem like a prime candidate.
Right. Something that could easily be handled centrally.
Exactly, by an agency like the GSA, which already does procurement for the whole government. So it does feel like all these pieces are connected in a way.
They do. It's like a puzzle.
Yeah.
And the article gives us one more important piece. It mentions this earlier report from GovExec.
Okay, what GovExec say?
They reported that OPM, which we know is one of the main targets for this GSA takeover, had already laid off their entire procurement team.
Wow, their whole team.
Yeah, and they called those positions abolished. So it's not even like those people were just reassigned. Those jobs are gone.
So it's not just a potential takeover. In OPM's case, the infrastructure for doing their own contracting is basically gone already.
Exactly. Makes it much easier for GSA to step in. No internal resistance to worry about.
Right, less friction. So let's recap what we know so far. We've got the GSA actively looking at expanding their role in contracting. They're focusing on agencies like OPM, Education, SBA, and HUD as their first targets.
Right.
And this seems to be part of a bigger reorganization within the FAS, maybe even connected to these older ideas about consolidating federal functions. And then there's this possibility of some agencies being eliminated entirely.
Yeah, so a lot of moving parts. And this article from Federal News Network, it really highlights how much is going on behind the scenes, stuff that could have a huge impact on how the government runs.
For sure. So let's switch gears a bit. I want to hear from you, the listener. What are your thoughts on this potential shakeup? I mean, consolidating contracting across agencies, it could make things more efficient. You could have more standardized processes.
Right, streamline things.
Exactly. And maybe even save some money with, like, bulk purchases.
Yeah, leverage that buying power.
Exactly. But, of course, there are always two sides to the coin. We have to consider the potential downsides, too.
Absolutely.
One big question that comes up is, what about the individual agencies? Like, do they have special needs when it comes to contracting? Needs that the GSA might not fully understand?
That's a good question. You know, you think about an agency like the SBA, Their whole focus is on supporting small businesses.
Right.
Or the education department, dealing with all these complex education programs.
Yeah.
Their contracting needs are probably very different from, say, OPM.
Totally different. So could a centralized system run by the GSA really address all those nuances?
That's the big question.
Mm-hmm.
Could they handle that level of specialization?
Yeah. And if not, could it actually make things less efficient in the long run?
Possibly. And then there's the whole issue of potential disruptions. As the GSA takes over, they're going to have to learn the ins and outs of each agency's contracts.
Right.
The vendors they work with, the ongoing requirements. That's a lot to absorb.
And remember that GSA employee who mentioned potential disruptions. That's a real concern.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, transferring responsibility for all those contracts, it's a huge undertaking. You have to build relationships with vendors, understand the history of the agreements.
And any mistakes during that transition could lead to delays, cost overruns, even legal problems if contracts aren't handled properly.
It's a lot of responsibility.
It is. And we can't forget about the people involved, the federal employees who work in these agencies. What happens to them if their jobs are moved over to the GSA?
Right, the human side of things.
The article mentions RIFs and transfers, and that could have a big impact on those people's career.
And their livelihoods, too.
Exactly. And there's also the risk of losing institutional knowledge, the expertise that those agencies have built up over time.
That's a good point. I mean, even if the GSA steps in, there's going to be a gap.
Right.
The relationships with vendors, the understanding of how things work in that specific agency, that doesn't just disappear overnight.
It takes time to rebuild that.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, it's worth thinking about this in the context of past government reforms. Have there been other attempts to centralize functions like this?
Mm-hmm.
And how did they turn out? Did they work?
Good question. Because government reorganizations, they often aim to improve things,
Right.
make things more efficient,
Right.
but they can also be really disruptive and expensive.
Absolutely.
They can face a lot of pushback from different groups.
So looking at what's worked in the past and what hasn't, that can give us some clues about how this might play out.
Yeah, learn from history.
Exactly. So to wrap things up, this article from Federal News Network really sheds light on the fact that the GSA is seriously considering a big change. They're thinking about taking over contracting from these other agencies. And it seems to be part of this larger reorganization, with maybe even bigger changes on the horizon.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on, and it has the potential to really change how the government functions.
No doubt. So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Given how complex federal contracting is, what do you think will be the biggest challenges for the GSA if they do take this on? And what would you look for to know if it's working or not?
Yeah, what would be the signs of success or failure?
Exactly, because efficiency is important, but so is specialization.
Yeah.
And accountability. It's a balancing act. So as these potential changes unfold, we'll be watching closely, and we encourage you to do the same. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks for having me.